The sun had not fully risen yet. 3 women were walking toward a tomb on the outskirts of Jerusalem, carrying spices they had prepared 2 days earlier. They were not walking toward a miracle. They were not walking toward an empty grave or an angel or a message that would change the course of human history. They were walking toward a body they had watched die, a body they had seen carried into a cave and sealed behind a stone that was far too heavy for them to move on their own. One of them said it out loud as they walked. "Who is going to roll the stone away for us?" That is how the last chapter of the Gospel of Mark begins. Not with prophecy fulfilled, not with angels descending from heaven in glory, with a practical problem that 3 grieving women were trying to solve on a dark road before sunrise. The stone was too heavy. They needed someone to move it. That was the whole of their concern as they walked. When they arrived, the stone was already gone. They went inside. A young man was sitting on the right side of the tomb, dressed in a white robe. Mark says they were alarmed. The young man told them not to be alarmed. He said, "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you." And then Mark wrote the last sentence of his gospel. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That is it. That is where the story stops. No risen Jesus walking out to meet them on the road. No appearance to the disciples in a locked room. No Thomas putting his fingers into the wounds. No breakfast on the beach. No moment where Jesus opens the scriptures to the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus and their hearts burn within them. No great commission on a hillside. No ascension into clouds while the disciples stand watching with their mouths open. Just 3 women running from a cave in the early morning, trembling, saying nothing to anyone because they were afraid. If you grew up going to church, if you have read a Bible that includes Mark 16, you probably never noticed any of this. Because your Bible kept going. Your Bible gave you Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, then to 2 disciples walking in the country, then to the 11, where he rebuked them for their unbelief, then the Great Commission, then the Ascension, then the disciples going everywhere and preaching and performing signs. A complete story, a satisfying arc, the kind of ending a gospel is supposed to have. But here is what changes everything. Those 12 verses were almost certainly not written by Mark. The 2 oldest and most complete Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that exist, manuscripts that scholars consider among the most important witnesses to the original text, both end the Gospel of Mark at verse 8. The trembling, the silence, the fear, and nothing after that. Jerome, the scholar who translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century, one of the most important biblical scholars in the history of Christianity, wrote that almost all Greek manuscripts he had examined did not contain those final 12 verses. Eusebius, the great church historian who wrote in the early 4th century, said the same thing. He addressed the question directly and noted that accurate copies of Mark ended at the empty tomb. This is not a fringe theory. This is not something someone invented on the internet to undermine faith. This is a question that serious scholars and serious Christians have been sitting with for centuries. Most modern Bible translations acknowledge it directly. placing a note before verse 9 that says something like, "The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 through 20. You may have read that footnote a dozen times and moved right past it." This is the story of what happens when you stop and actually look at what it means. Because the question is not really whether 12 verses were added to the gospel later. The question underneath that question is what it means that the oldest recoverable ending of the oldest gospel leaves us standing here, at an empty tomb, with 3 frightened women, with a message that was given and then immediately swallowed by silence. What kind of gospel ends there? That question does not have a simple answer, but it has a real one. And to find it, you have to go back to the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark and understand what kind of story this was always trying to be. Mark does not ease you into anything. Open the Gospel, and the first thing you notice is what is missing. There is no Christmas story. No angel appearing to Mary in a quiet room in Nazareth. No census that sends Joseph and a pregnant teenager across the countryside to Bethlehem. No monger. No shepherds. No star rising in the east. No magi carrying gold and frankincense and myrrh. There is no genealogy carefully tracing Jesus back through 42 generations to Abraham. There is no soaring prologue about the Word being in the beginning with God. In the beginning, before anything existed. Mark opens like this: the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. One sentence. And then John the Baptist is in the wilderness. And then Jesus is at the Jordan being baptized. And then the Spirit is driving him into the wilderness to be tempted. And then he is in Galilee, calling his first disciples. And they drop everything and follow him immediately. All of that happens in 13 verses. That word, immediately, is the key to understanding Mark. In Greek, the word is ethis. Scholars count it, appearing more than 40 times in 16 chapters. Jesus healed a man in the synagogue, and immediately his fame spread everywhere. He left the synagogue and immediately went to Simon's house. He called to James and John, and immediately they left their father in the boat and followed him. A leper came to him, and immediately Jesus reached out his hand. Immediately, at once, right away, without pause, without transition, without the kind of narrative breathing room that lets a reader settle into a scene before the story moves on. Matthew and Luke take their time. They build context. They arrange material thematically. They give you sermons and genealogies and birth narratives and long dialogues. John moves slowly and philosophically, circling around ideas like light and darkness and the Word becoming flesh. Mark runs, not because the writer was careless or in a hurry in some accidental way, because the story Mark was telling demanded that pace. Because in Mark, the kingdom of God is not something that approaches gradually and announces itself politely. It breaks in. It interrupts. It seizes people in the middle of their ordinary lives and does not wait for them to be ready. But the speed is not the most unsettling thing about Mark. The most unsettling thing about Mark is what it shows you about the people who were closest to Jesus. In Matthew, the disciples are flawed, but fundamentally dignified. They are the foundation of the church. Peter is the rock on which everything will be built. In Luke, they are witnesses whose testimony will carry the story to the ends of the earth. In John, they are the beloved community, the ones Jesus calls friends rather than servants. On the last night of his life, the ones he washes the feet of before everything falls apart. In Mark, they almost never understand what is happening. Jesus stills a violent storm on the Sea of Galilee. The water goes calm in an instant. The wind stops, and the disciples, who have just watched this happen from a few feet away, turn to each other and say, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" They have been traveling with him. They have watched him preach and heal and cast out demons. They have heard the crowds respond. And in the middle of a miraculously calm sea, they are asking each other who he is. Jesus feeds 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Everyone eats until they are full, and there are 12 baskets of leftovers. Afterward, Jesus walks out to the disciples across the water in the middle of the night, and they do not recognize him. They think he is a ghost, and they cry out in fear. And 4W. Mark records what happened next with a sentence that stops you cold. He says they were utterly astounded because they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were hardened. That is the phrase Mark uses to describe the condition of the disciples in the boat. The same phrase used earlier in the Gospel to describe the Pharisees who were watching Jesus, plotting against him, waiting for a reason to destroy him. The disciples and the enemies of Jesus, described with the same words. The hardened hearts, the failure to perceive. Peter makes the great confession at Caesarea Philippi. You are the Messiah. It is the theological turning point of the Gospel, the moment when a human being finally names out loud who Jesus is. And then, almost immediately, when Jesus begins explaining what being the Messiah actually means, that it means betrayal and suffering and death, Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him. The man who just identified Jesus correctly tells Jesus he is wrong about his own destiny. And Jesus turns, looks at the disciples standing behind Peter, and says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." The disciples argue about which one of them is the greatest. They argue about this on the road to Jerusalem, directly after Jesus has told them for the second time that he is going to be handed over and killed. He tells them he is going to die, and they respond by debating their own status in the kingdom they are already planning to run. A mother of 2 of the disciples comes to Jesus and asks if her sons can sit at his right and left hand in glory. The other 10 disciples find out about this request and become indignant, not because the request was inappropriate, because they wanted those seats for themselves. In Gethsemane, the night everything falls apart, Jesus asks Peter and James and John to keep watch while he prays. He comes back and finds them sleeping. He wakes them and goes back to pray. He comes back again and finds them sleeping again. The third time he comes back, he does not even try to wake them. He just says, "Are you still sleeping and resting?" Enough. When the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, Mark says, everyone deserted him and fled. Everyone. Not most of them. Not the ones who were not really committed. Everyone. They all ran. There is a detail in that arrest scene that appears nowhere else in any of the 4 Gospels. A young man was following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. When the soldiers seized him, he left the cloth in their hands and ran away naked. Mark gives this person no name, no introduction, no explanation. He appears in 1 sentence and disappears from the Gospel entirely. Nobody knows who he was. Nobody knows why Mark included him. But something about him matters, because Mark chose to put him there, in the most desperate moment of the entire story. Even a nameless bystander, with nothing at stake, preferred to run naked into the night rather than stay. And Peter, the rock, the one who swore he would never deny Jesus, even if everyone else did, denied knowing him 3 times before the rooster crowed. Mark describes the aftermath with 5 of the most desolate words in the New Testament. And he broke down and wept. No absolution follows. No restoration scene. No moment where Jesus finds Peter after the resurrection and tells him it is okay. Tells him he is forgiven. Tells him he still has a role to play. In Mark, there is no such scene. Peter weeps, and the story moves on without him. Now hold all of that in your mind and look at the other pattern running through the gospel alongside the disciples' failure. The people who see Jesus most clearly in Mark are almost never the people you would expect. A man possessed by an unclean spirit cries out in a synagogue at the very beginning of the gospel, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." A demon says it, before any of the disciples have understood anything, before Peter's confession, before the transfiguration. A demon identifies Jesus correctly in the first chapter. A woman who has been bleeding for 12 years, who has spent everything she had on doctors who only made her condition worse, pushes through a crowd to touch the hem of Jesus' cloak. She does not ask his permission. She does not introduce herself. She simply reaches out and touches the cloth, and immediately her bleeding stops, and she feels it in her body. Jesus stops and asks who touched him. The disciples, baffled, point out that there are dozens of people pressing against him from every side. He keeps looking. The woman comes forward, frightened, and tells him everything. And Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Your faith, not his power deployed on her behalf. Her faith, reaching out and making contact with something. A Syrophoenician woman, a Gentile, not Jewish, from a group that the Jewish world of the first century had very specific reasons to consider outside the covenant, comes to Jesus and asks him to drive a demon out of her daughter. Jesus tells her that it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. It is one of the hardest things Jesus says in any gospel. She does not back down. She says, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And Jesus tells her that because of her answer, the demon has left her daughter. She has argued with him and won. Mark does not soften this or explain it away. It is simply there. A Gentile woman outside every category of insider, talking back to Jesus and getting what she came for. And then there is the moment at the cross. The disciples are gone. They ran in Gethsemane, and they did not come back. The crucifixion in Mark happens without them present, without any of the beloved disciple standing nearby, without any of the intimate final conversations that John records. Jesus dies in Mark with a cry of desolation. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And the sound of that cry, and the sight of the curtain of the temple tearing from top to bottom, those two things together prompt a reaction from a Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross. This man, a soldier in the army that just executed Jesus, a Gentile, an agent of the empire, says, "Surely This man was the Son of God. He is the first human being in the entire Gospel of Mark to say that out loud and mean it in the full sense. Not a demon, not a voice from heaven. A Roman soldier at an execution. The insiders failed. The outsiders saw. The ones who were supposed to understand did not. The ones who had no reason to understand. The bleeding woman. The Syrophoenician mother. The enemy soldier. They are the ones who perceived what was actually happening. That is the gospel, Mark wrote. That is the world the ending of that gospel lands in. So when 3 women, not the 11, not Peter, who was told specifically that a message was waiting for him, but 3 women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and watched the crucifixion from a distance and noted where the tomb was. When those 3 women receive the most important message in the history of the gospel and respond by running away in silence. That is not a surprise ending. That is the only ending this gospel was ever building toward. A gospel about people who could not understand, running away from the thing they had been given to carry, and a question left hanging in the air where the final page should be. What happens after the running? What happens after the silence? What happens to a message that the first people to receive it were too afraid to deliver? To begin answering that, you have to know what the oldest surviving copies of this gospel actually show. And that story starts with a young German scholar, a basket of papers by a fireplace, and a monastery at the foot of a mountain that had been keeping its secrets for more than 1,000 years. In the summer of 1844, a 29-year-old German scholar named Konstantin von Tischendorf arrived at a monastery sitting at the base of Mount Sinai in what is now Egypt. He had been traveling for months. He had already visited libraries and monastery collections across the Middle East, examining manuscripts, cataloging fragments, building a case that the Greek text of the New Testament, as most Christians read it, had a longer and more complicated history than anyone had been willing to publicly acknowledge. He was brilliant, and he knew it, which made him both an extraordinary scholar and a difficult person to spend extended time with. But his instincts about where important manuscripts might still be waiting were good, and St. Catherine's Monastery was at the top of his list. St. Catherine's had been continuously occupied since the 6th century. It sat in one of the most remote and inhospitable landscapes on earth, surrounded by desert and rock, connected to the outside world by routes that had not fundamentally changed since ancient times. Its library had been accumulating manuscripts for more than 12 centuries, and because of its isolation, because no army had sacked it, and no fire had swept through it, and no administrator had ever reorganized its collection according to the priorities of a later era, it held things that the rest of the Christian world had long since lost track of. What Tischendorf found there, on that first visit, was almost destroyed before he could save it. He was walking through the monastery when he noticed a large basket near one of the fireplaces. Inside the basket were loose sheets of old parchment, apparently set aside as rubbish, things too worn or too damaged to be worth keeping. Tischendorf picked up one of the sheets and looked at it. Then he looked more carefully. The handwriting was ancient Greek, careful and practiced, the kind of hand that belonged to a professional scribe who had spent a lifetime at this work. The parchment itself had the color and texture of something very old. He understood almost immediately that he was looking at a biblical manuscript of extraordinary antiquity. He learned from the monks that 2 baskets of similar material had already been burned as waste. He managed to take 43 sheets with him when he left, with the monks' permission. Not fully understanding yet what they were giving him, he promised to return. It took him 15 more years. When Tischendorf came back to St. Catherine's in 1859, he came under the sponsorship of the Russian Tsar, and with the full backing of the scholarly world that had spent the intervening years trying to understand the fragments he had brought back from his first visit. On this third trip, a monk showed him a bundle of parchment he had not seen before, wrapped in a red cloth and stored separately from the main collection. Tischendorf unwrapped it. He looked at what was inside. According to his own account, he could hardly contain himself for the rest of that day, waiting until evening when he could be alone to examine it properly. It was what scholars would come to call Codex Sinaiticus, a hand-copied Greek Bible from the 4th century, one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Christian scriptures ever discovered. It contained most of the Old Testament in Greek and nearly the entire New Testament, written on fine parchment in a clear, practiced hand, 4 columns to a page. It was the kind of manuscript that scholars spend careers hoping to find and most never do. Tischendorf turned to the Gospel of Mark. He read through chapter 15, the crucifixion, the burial, Joseph of Arimathea asking for the body, the stone rolled across the entrance of the tomb. He turned to chapter 16, the women arriving at the tomb, the stone already moved, the young man in white, the message about Galilee, and then verse 8. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The scribe continued directly to the Gospel of Luke. No verses 9 through 20. No Mary Magdalene appearance. No Great Commission. No Ascension. Nothing. Tischendorf was not entirely surprised. He had suspected something like this might be true based on the fragments he had examined on his first visit and based on what he had read in the early Church Fathers. But seeing it here, in one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts in existence, written in a hand from the 4th century by a scribe who had devoted enormous care and resources to this work, gave the question a weight that suspicion alone could not provide. And Codex Sinaiticus was not alone. Sitting in the Vatican Library in Rome was another manuscript, Codex Vaticanus, also from the 4th century, also considered by scholars to be one of the most important witnesses to the original text of the New Testament. Scholars examining it found the same thing Tischendorf found in Sinaiticus. Mark ended at verse 8, but Codex Vaticanus had something else, something that stopped careful readers in a way that the mere absence of the longer ending could not. After the final words of Mark 16, verse 8, the scribe of Codex Vaticanus left a blank column in a manuscript where every column on every page is filled with text from edge to edge, where parchment was expensive and space was never wasted. There is a deliberate, empty space right where the continuation of Mark should be. The scribe finished verse 8, moved to the next column, and left it white. Then the scribe began the Gospel of Luke. Scholars have looked at that blank column for a very long time. The most careful explanation is that the scribe knew other manuscripts contained additional material at this point, but had reasons to consider it secondary, not part of the original text, and chose to leave the space as a kind of acknowledgement that something was in question here. Rather than copying verses, the scribe did not trust, or simply running Luke up against the abrupt ending of Mark, with no indication that anything was unusual. The scribe did something that took more thought than either of those options. The scribe left a space, a visible, deliberate, unmistakable space that said to anyone reading, "Something belongs here, and I am not certain what it is." That blank column is one of the most honest moments in the entire manuscript tradition of the New Testament. A scribe in the 4th century, handling the most sacred text in their world, chose uncertainty over false completeness. Now, here is where the historical picture becomes more complicated, and the full picture requires saying so. The blank column in Vaticanus and the abrupt ending in Sinaiticus are the two most famous pieces of evidence that Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, were not part of the original gospel, but they are not the only evidence. Eusebius of Caesarea, the church historian who wrote in the early 4th century, addressed the ending of Mark directly in his writings. A reader had written to him asking how to reconcile the resurrection accounts in the different Gospels. Eusebius answered the question, and in the course of answering it, he noted that the passage, beginning at verse 9, was not present in accurate copies. He wrote that a person could say the section from verse 9 onward was not present in all the copies of Mark, that accurate ones ended the account of Mark at the words of the young man who appeared to the women. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century, and whose translation became the standard Bible of the Western Church for more than 1,000 years, said the same thing. He noted that almost all Greek manuscripts he had examined did not contain the longer ending, while acknowledging that some copies did include it. These are not modern skeptics looking for reasons to doubt the Bible. Eusebius and Jerome were 4th century Christian scholars who devoted their entire lives to understanding and preserving the Scriptures. They were not arguing against the resurrection or against the authority of Mark. They were reporting what they found when they looked carefully at the manuscripts available to them. And what they found was a problem at exactly this point in the text. But here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated in ways that require equal honesty. The longer ending, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, is ancient. It appears in a very large number of manuscripts. It was being quoted by church fathers as early as the 2nd century. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 of the Common Era, cited verse 19 of the longer ending as scripture, which means that within roughly 100 years of the Gospel being written, some Christian communities were already reading this material as part of Mark and treating it as authoritative. The Diatessaron, a harmony of the 4 Gospels composed around 170 by a scholar named Tatian, appears to have incorporated material from the longer ending of Mark. The Epistola Apostolorum, a 2nd century Christian text, seems to know the longer ending as well. These are not late medieval additions. They are 2nd century references. There is also a 3rd version of the ending, what scholars call the shorter ending, which appears in a handful of manuscripts, either instead of the longer ending or alongside it. The shorter ending reads, in rough translation, that the women reported everything they had been told briefly to those around Peter, and that afterward Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. It is a few sentences. It is clearly constructed to bridge the gap between verse 8 and the broader resurrection tradition, and it has the quality of something written by someone who knew a gap existed and was doing their best to close it with the materials available. Two separate attempts to complete the same gospel, both circulating by the 2nd century, one much more widely distributed than the other, both preserved by communities that found them meaningful enough to copy and pass on. What this tells you, taken together with the blank column in Vaticanus and the testimony of Eusebius and Jerome, is that the question about the ending of Mark was not invented by modern scholars looking for problems. The question was alive in the ancient church. People who were copying and reading and arguing about these texts in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries knew something was uncertain here, and they responded to that uncertainty in different ways. Some left a blank space. Some added a short bridge. Some added 12 verses. Some copied what they had and moved on. The manuscripts do not give you a single, clean answer. They give you a picture of a community grappling across generations and geographies with a gospel that ended in a place where communities needed more than it gave them, and understanding why communities needed more, understanding what it was about that ending that made it so difficult to simply accept, requires understanding something about what happens to a person when a sacred story stops too soon. That understanding starts not with scholars or manuscripts or church councils. It starts with a scribe sitting alone in a room, reading the last line of Mark for the first time, and feeling something that every reader since has felt in some form, the feeling that this cannot be where it ends. Picture a room somewhere in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. It could be in Antioch. It could be in Alexandria. It could be in one of the smaller cities that the letters of Paul passed through on their way across the Mediterranean world. A city with a small Christian community meeting in someone's house, sharing meals, reading texts aloud to each other, arguing about what those texts meant and how to live by them. In this room, a person is copying the Gospel of Mark. We do not know this person's name. We do not know if they were a man or a woman, a trained professional scribe or a community member who had simply learned to write well enough to reproduce a text carefully. We know almost nothing about the circumstances of this particular copying session, whether it was done quickly or slowly, whether there was anyone else in the room, whether it was done in daylight or by the light of an oil lamp in the evening. What we know is what happened when this person reached the end of chapter 16. They copied the women arriving at the tomb. They copied the young man in white and his message about Galilee. They copied the women's response. They wrote out the last line. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then they stopped, not because they had finished, because the text had finished before they were ready for it to finish. Think about what this person knew. They were a member of a community built entirely on the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead. The resurrection was not a footnote to their faith. It was the center of it. Paul had written to the Corinthians, probably 20 years before any of the Gospels were written in their current form, that if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. The resurrection was the thing the entire structure of early Christian belief rested on. Without it, nothing else held. And here was the gospel that most of the early church appeared to understand as the oldest account of Jesus' life. The gospel that had been used as a source by Matthew and Luke when they wrote their own accounts. The gospel that carried enormous authority precisely because of its age and its apparent closeness to eyewitness testimony. And this gospel ended with the resurrection unwitnessed with the tomb empty? Yes. With a message delivered? Yes. But with no risen Jesus appearing to anyone. With the first people to receive the resurrection news responding to it by running away in silence. The scribe in that second-century room put down their pen and looked at the page. And then they picked the pen back up. What they wrote after verse 8 was not random. It was not invented from whole cloth by someone who had no knowledge of resurrection traditions. The longer ending of Mark draws on material that was already circulating in the early Christian world. The appearance to Mary Magdalene appears in a similar form in the Gospel of John. The appearance to two disciples walking in the country resembles the Road to Emmaus story in Luke. The Great Commission and the Ascension have parallels in Matthew and Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. The longer ending reads like a careful compilation of resurrection traditions that the writer knew from other sources, arranged to give Mark the kind of conclusion that the writer felt the gospel required. That is not deception. That is a community response to a text that left them with something they did not know what to do with. But look at the seams, because the seams tell you something important about what actually happened. The longer ending begins in verse 9 with the phrase, "When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had driven out 7 demons. That phrase, "from whom he had driven out 7 demons," is there to identify Mary Magdalene for the reader. It is an identifying detail, the kind of thing a writer includes when they are introducing a character who has not been mentioned recently. But Mary Magdalene was mentioned in verse 1 of the same chapter. She was named as one of the 3 women who went to the tomb. She was named again in chapter 15 as one of the women watching the crucifixion from a distance. She has appeared 3 times in the preceding verses. No writer who had just written verse 8 would feel the need to reintroduce her 8 lines later with an identifying detail about her past. The reintroduction is the signature of someone beginning from a fresh starting point, drawing on a source that described this appearance to Mary Magdalene, as if the reader had not just been reading about her in the previous verses. Whoever wrote verse 9 was not continuing from verse 8. They were starting from somewhere else and attaching their starting point to a place in the text where they felt continuation was needed. The vocabulary in the longer ending is also different in ways that scholars have documented carefully over more than a century of analysis. Several words appearing in verses 9 through 20 do not appear anywhere else in the 16 chapters of Mark. The way certain phrases are constructed shifts. The pace of the narrative changes. Mark runs through his 16 chapters with that relentless euthus, that sense of urgent forward momentum, and the longer ending war. None of this makes the people who wrote or preserved or treasured the longer ending into villains. It makes them human beings doing what human beings do when they love a story that feels unfinished. Consider what it means to love a story. Really love it. The way communities love the texts that define them. When a story you love ends in a way that feels wrong, feels incomplete, feels like it has left the most important thing unsaid, you do not simply close the book and walk away. You carry the ending around with you. You turn it over. You imagine what should have come next. You tell other people your version. And if you happen to be a scribe with a pen in your hand and a manuscript in front of you that needs copying, you write it. The shorter ending. Those few sentences about the women reporting to those around Peter and Jesus sending out the proclamation from east to west is an even more revealing response to the same problem. It is so brief, so clearly patched, that it communicates something almost painfully honest about the person who wrote it. They knew something was missing, They knew the text needed a bridge between verse 8 and the broader resurrection tradition. But they either did not have the longer ending available to them, or they did not feel confident enough in it to use it. So they wrote something minimal, something that acknowledged the gap without pretending to fully close it. Two different writers, in two different places, at two different moments in the 2nd century, both responding to the same experience of reading verse 8 and finding it insufficient. Their responses were different in length and in confidence, but the impulse was identical. And here is the thing that makes those responses so revealing about the power of what they were responding to. The crucifixion does not produce this kind of reaction in the manuscript tradition. The crucifixion is devastating. It is the death of the person the entire gospel has been about. It happens in graphic detail. Jesus cries out that God has forsaken him. Hades. The curtain of the temple tears. It is not a comfortable scene, but no one in the ancient church felt the need to add an alternative crucifixion. No scribe produced a shorter version of the cross that was easier to accept. The death is hard, but the death is complete. It does what deaths do. It ends. The ending of Mark at verse 8 does something different from ending. It suspends. It leaves the most important event in the story announced but not witnessed. It gives you the empty tomb and the message and the fear and the running, and then it gives you nothing else. And that suspension, that refusal to complete the arc, was apparently one of the most unbearable things early Christian readers ever encountered in a sacred text. More unbearable, in some ways, than the death, because the death is comprehensible. The world kills people who threaten it. That is a story human beings have always known how to tell. But a resurrection story that ends before anyone sees the risen Jesus, that ends with the witnesses too frightened to speak, that puts the most transformative claim in the history of the faith in the mouths of people who immediately go silent. That ending violates something deep in the way human beings need stories to work. We need the arc to close. We need the hero to return. We need the people who received the news to eventually deliver it, to transform from frightened runners into witnesses, to become the thing the story has been building toward. Mark gives us none of that. And the people who could not leave that alone, the ones who picked up their pens and kept writing, were not corrupting a sacred text. They were doing what every reader does when a story asks more of them than they feel ready to give. They were trying to finish something that had been left unfinished in their hands, what they may not have understood. And what the blank column in Codex Vaticanus suggests, at least one careful scribe in the 4th century was beginning to understand, is that the unfinished quality might not have been an accident, that the space might have been left on purpose, that the story might have needed to be unfinished in order to do what it was trying to do. Take the last two words of the Gospel of Mark in the original Greek and hold them for a moment. Ephobuntogar. Sound them out if you want. Ephobuntogar. The first word is a verb. It means they were afraid. It comes from the Greek word phobos, which is where the English word phobia comes from. The deep unreasoning fear of something that has power over you. Ephobunto is the imperfect form of that verb, which in Greek means the fear was ongoing. Not a single moment of fright that passed quickly, but a state of being that had settled into them and was still there when the sentence ended. The second word is ga. It means for, or because. It is a conjunction, a connecting word, the kind of word that links one thought to the thought before it. It explains. It looks backward. In Greek, gar is almost always the second word in a clause, sitting just after the thing it is explaining, pointing back at what came before. In the entire body of ancient Greek literature, from Homer to Plato to Thucydides to the Greek playwrights, no surviving work ends with gar. Not one. The word is a connector. It reaches backward for something to hold on to. When you end a sentence with it, you leave the reader's mind reaching backward too, looking for the thing the sentence is supposed to be explaining, finding only the sentence itself, looking back at them. You create a grammatical loop that has no exit. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. For the story does not end. It explains why it does not end, and then it stops. That two-word ending has produced more scholarly debate than almost any other pair of words in the New Testament. One side of the debate says the grammar alone proves the original ending was lost. No writer in the ancient world would deliberately close a book with a conjunction. The rules of Greek composition simply did not allow it. The gar is the equivalent of a sentence that trails off in the middle of a word, evidence not of intention, but of incompletion. A text that was cut short before it reached its destination. The other side says the exact opposite. They say that a writer willing to use gar at the end of a gospel was a writer who understood precisely what that choice would do to a reader, who understood that ending with a backward-looking conjunction would leave the reader suspended in the same grammatical space the women were suspended in at the tomb, reaching for something to hold on to, finding only their own response to what they had just been told. They say the violation of convention was the point, that the most deliberately unconventional gospel ever written chose the most unconventional possible ending as its final statement. Both arguments are serious. Both have been made by people who have given years to this question. The grammar cannot settle it. So look at the whole gospel, because the whole gospel is the only context in which the ending can be properly read. Go back to the very first chapter of Mark. Jesus is baptized, and the heavens tear open, and the Spirit descends on him like a dove, and a voice from heaven says, "You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." It is the most direct divine affirmation in the entire gospel. God speaks. God claims Jesus. And then, immediately, the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness. Not leads, drives. The same verb Mark uses for driving out demons. The divine affirmation and the wilderness temptation are not separated by reflection or ceremony. They happen in immediate sequence. The declaration of identity followed instantly by the testing of it. That is the rhythm of Mark. The sacred thing and the difficult thing arriving together, with no comfortable space between them. Go to chapter 4. Jesus is teaching large crowds from a boat. And after a long day of parables, he pulls his disciples aside and tells them something that has troubled readers ever since. He says the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to them, but for those on the outside, everything comes in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven, ever seeing but never perceiving. That phrase is a quotation from the prophet Isaiah, and it refers in its original context to a people who had become so settled in their understanding of God that the actual presence of God could pass right through them without being recognized. Mark places it in the mouth of Jesus as a description of the gap between the event and its meaning. The gap between what is visible and what is actually being seen. The gap that the disciples will spend the entire gospel failing to cross. And it is not just the disciples. There is a scene in chapter 6 where Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth. He teaches in the synagogue, and the people who hear him are astonished. They say, "Where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom that has been given him?" And then they say, "Is this not the carpenter? Is this not Mary's son, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? Is this not the man whose sisters live here among us?" And Mark records that Jesus could not do any miracles there, except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. And he was amazed at their lack of faith. He was amazed. The word in Greek is etaumazen, the same word used when the disciples are amazed, when the crowds are amazed, when people are astonished at something they cannot account for. The people in Nazareth looked at Jesus and saw a carpenter they had grown up with, someone whose family they knew, someone with no particular claim to the authority he was exercising. And faced with that reduction, faced with being seen as ordinary by people who had watched him grow up, Jesus himself was amazed. Familiarity is a form of blindness in Mark. The people who knew him best in his hometown could not see him at all. The people who did not know him, who had no prior category for him, who came to him with nothing but their own need, those people saw him clearly. Think about who sees Jesus clearly in this gospel. The demons see him clearly. In chapter 1, the man with the unclean spirit cries out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The demon identifies Jesus accurately at the beginning of the gospel, before any human being in the story has managed it. Jesus silences the demon and drives it out. But the demon's testimony is the first clear statement of identity in the entire narrative. The bleeding woman sees him clearly. She has been ill for 12 years. She has spent everything she had on Dionysians. She is ceremonially unclean by the standards of her world, which means she has been living in social isolation for 12 years. On top of the physical suffering, she does not ask permission to approach Jesus. She does not announce herself. She pushes through the crowd and touches his cloak because she believes that if she can just make contact, something will happen. And it does. Mark says that immediately the bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. The healing happens through her own faith, reaching out, not through Jesus directing his power at her. He did not even know she was there until it happened. The Syrophoenician woman sees him clearly. Jesus is in Gentile territory, trying to be alone, and she finds him and falls at his feet and begs him to drive a demon out of her daughter. Jesus says, "First, let the children eat all they want, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." It is an extraordinarily difficult thing for him to say, and readers have been wrestling with it for centuries. The woman does not flinch. She says, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And Jesus tells her that for such a reply, the demon has left her daughter. She did not accept the limitation. She saw through the limitation to the person she believed was behind it. And she made her case, and she won. The Roman centurion at the cross sees him clearly. The disciples are gone. The crowds have turned. The religious authorities are watching and mocking. And this soldier, this representative of the empire that has just executed Jesus, This man, with no theological training and no community of faith and no prior relationship with Jesus or his followers, watches Jesus die and says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." He is the only human being in the entire Gospel of Mark who says that and means it fully. Not a disciple, not a scribe, not one of the people who had been following Jesus for 3 years and hearing him teach and watching him heal and asking him questions. A Roman soldier at an execution. Now bring all of that with you to chapter 16. The women at the tomb are not random. They are the culmination of everything Mark has been showing you about who sees clearly and who does not. They are identified specifically: Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome. They are named 3 times across the final 2 chapters of the Gospel, which is significant in a text that moves as fast as Mark does. Mark names them at the crucifixion, where they are watching from a distance. Mark names them at the burial, where they see where the body is laid. And Mark names them again at the tomb. They watched the crucifixion from a distance when the disciples had fled entirely. Distance from a crucifixion in 1st century Jerusalem was not accidental. Women standing at a public execution of a man who had been declared an enemy of the state were taking a risk. Not the same risk the disciples would have faced, perhaps, but a real one. They stayed. They noted where the body was laid. This detail matters more than it might seem. The burial was handled by Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the council, a man with the social standing to go to Pilate and ask for the body. The disciples did not do this. They were not there. The women were there. They watched. They remembered the location. And because they remembered, they knew where to go when the Sabbath was over. They went out before dawn on the first day of the week and walked to the tomb in the dark, carrying spices, concerned about a practical obstacle, the stone, not expecting anything other than a body that needed anointing. They were not going to the tomb because they believed in the resurrection. They were going because they had loved someone, and that person was dead, and there was a task left unfinished, and they were going to finish it. These are the most faithful witnesses in the final sequence of the Gospel. Not the 11, not the inner circle. 3 women who had followed from Galilee, who had stayed at the cross, who had noted the burial place, who had gone home and prepared spices and observed the Sabbath and come back before the sun was up. And to these women, the most faithful witnesses in the narrative, the message is given: He has risen. He is not here. Go, tell his disciples and Peter. Tell his disciples and Peter. The specification of Peter is striking. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times. Peter, who broke down and wept. Peter, for whom a specific message is being sent, whose name is called out individually, as if to say, yes, even him, especially him. The denial does not end the story for Peter in Mark. There is still something waiting for him in Galilee. The women receive all of this. They hear it. They understand it. Or at least they have been given it clearly enough to understand. And then they run. They went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. The Greek word for trembling here is tromos. It appears only this one time in the entire Gospel of Mark. It is a full-body physical response, the kind of trembling that takes over when something happens that is larger than your nervous system knows how to process. The Greek word for astonishment is ekstasis, from which the English word ecstasy comes. But in this context, it does not mean pleasure. It means a state of being beside yourself, outside your normal capacity for response, standing at the edge of something so far beyond ordinary experience that your ordinary faculties simply stop working. And then the final clause, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The fear in Mark is never simple cowardice. Go back through the gospel and look at every place where people are afraid in the presence of Jesus or in the presence of the divine, and you will find a consistent pattern. When the disciples are afraid in the boat after the stilling of the storm, they are afraid because they have just watched the laws of nature suspended in front of them. When the crowds are afraid after the exorcism in the synagogue, they are afraid because they have encountered authority of a kind that has no category in their previous experience. When Herod is afraid of John the Baptist, it is because he recognizes that John is a genuinely righteous man, and Herod does not know what to do with genuine righteousness. The fear in Mark is the fear of the genuinely unprecedented, the fear that comes not from danger, but from reality, from standing in front of something so real and so large that your normal equipment for processing experience simply cannot handle it. The women at the tomb are not afraid because they are weak. They are not afraid because their faith is insufficient. They are afraid because they have just been handed the most reality they have ever encountered in their lives, concentrated into a message they have been asked to carry, and they do not yet have what they need to carry it. That is the most honest thing anyone in the Gospel of Mark ever does. Because think about what it would actually mean to speak, to walk out of that tomb and find a person, any person, and say to them, "He is risen." 2 words. The whole architecture of the world changed in 2 words. Who would believe you? What would your face look like trying to say it? What would your voice sound like carrying something that heavy? How do you take the most disorienting experience of your life, an experience so far outside anything you had prepared for that your whole body went into trembling and astonishment, and turn it into a sentence that another person can receive? The women say nothing because there are no words yet adequate to what they know. And Mark, the writer who has been running his whole gospel, who has driven this story forward with that relentless, immediately, add-ons. Right now, Mark stops here, at the place where language runs out, at the place where the story becomes too large for the people inside it. He stops at the last moment of silence before the speaking. Now look at the literary structure of the whole gospel in light of that ending, because it reveals something that cannot be accidental. The messianic secret, the pattern of Jesus commanding silence throughout Mark, runs from the first chapter to the last. Jesus heals a leper and says, "See that you say nothing to anyone." He raises Jairus' daughter and gives strict orders that no one should know about it. He heals a deaf man in the region of the Decapolis and orders them not to tell anyone. After Peter's confession, he gives strict orders not to tell anyone about him. After the transfiguration, he charges the disciples to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Tell no one. Say nothing. The command of silence is one of the most persistent features of the Gospel of Mark, and it never works. Every time Jesus commands silence, people disobey. Mark notes repeatedly that the more he commanded silence, the more they talked. The man he healed in the Decapolis went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. The pattern holds across the whole gospel. Jesus says, "Be silent," and people speak. Jesus says, "Keep this secret," and the secret spreads until the very end, until the moment when the silence is not commanded. At the tomb, no one tells the women to say nothing. The young man in white tells them explicitly to go and speak. He gives them a message and a destination and names the person to whom the message should be delivered. The command in chapter 16, verse 7 is to tell, to speak, to go. And for the first and only time in the entire Gospel of Mark, the command of silence wins. The women say nothing. The one time in 16 chapters when silence is the wrong response, when the story needs speaking, when the message is the whole point and the delivery of the message is the entire purpose of everything that has happened. Silence is what happens. That is either the most devastating irony ever written into a gospel or the most perfectly constructed literary ending in the New Testament. It may be both. The whole gospel has been a story about people failing to understand, failing to perceive, seeing but not seeing, hearing but not hearing. And the final image is the ultimate expression of that failure. The message given, the messenger struck silent, the story suspended at the exact moment it most needed to move. And then the word "gar," for, because. The sentence reaches backward. The reader reaches backward, looking for the continuation, finding only the empty tomb and the silence and the fear. What Mark has done, deliberately or by accident, or by some combination of the two that cannot be fully separated, is put the reader in the position of the women, holding something that has been given to them, not certain what to do with it, standing at the threshold between the receiving of the news and the telling of it. The reader is the next person in the story, and the story does not tell you what to do. There are 3 genuine ways to read the ending of Mark, not 3 opinions that differ in their level of faith or their degree of scholarship. 3 real possibilities, each supported by actual evidence, each carrying something that has to be reckoned with. The honest approach is to look at all 3 of them without deciding in advance which one you need to be true, and to feel the weight of what each one asks you to accept. The first possibility is that Mark ended at verse 8 on purpose. This is the reading that the internal structure of the Gospel points toward most consistently. The motifs have been there since chapter 1. Fear and silence, and the gap between seeing and understanding are not features of the ending alone. They are the texture of the whole narrative. The pattern of outsiders perceiving what insiders miss. The relentless movement toward moments of confrontation with something too large for ordinary response. The messianic secret and its repeated failures. The disciples who see everything and understand nothing. The women who understand and then cannot speak. All of it points toward an ending that is not accidental, but architectural. The ending fits the gospel the way the final note fits a piece of music that has been built around unresolved tension throughout. If Mark intended verse 8 as the ending, then what he gave the church was not a comfortable proclamation with a satisfying conclusion. He gave them an open wound. He took the most important claim in the history of his faith and presented it not in triumph, but in terror. The resurrection in Mark is not announced by Jesus standing before his disciples with wounds that can be touched. It is announced by an unnamed young man in white to 3 women who immediately go silent. The validation of the claim. The appearance, the recognition, the conversation, the commission. None of that is given. What is given is the empty tomb and the message and the fear and the silence and the word for. The cost of accepting this is real, and it deserves to be named directly. It means accepting that the writer of the earliest gospel thought that silence and fear were an adequate response to the resurrection, not the final response, not the desired response, but the honest first response of people who had encountered something genuine and enormous. It means sitting with a gospel that trusts the reader to carry what the characters could not. It means accepting that the story was handed to you incomplete, not because something went wrong in transmission, but because incompleteness was the intended form. Some readers find this not just acceptable, but more powerful than any appearance narrative could be. The empty tomb as the whole of the testimony, the message delivered and then sealed in silence. The resurrection present in the story not as a visible event, but as an absence, a space where something had been, the negative shape of what was missing. The truth of it attested not by what is there, but by what is not there. The body that was laid in the tomb and is no longer in the tomb. The story that should have ended and does not end. The sentence that reaches backward, looking for completion, it does not find. Other readers find this insufficient. The desire to see the risen Jesus, to have the story deliver what it has been building toward, to receive confirmation rather than suspension. That desire is not a failure of faith. It is a human response to a human need. The need for the story to close. The need for the witnesses to eventually become testifiers. The need for the silence to break. That need is not weakness. It is what made the gospel worth telling in the first place. Which brings you to the second possibility. The second possibility is that the original ending of Mark was lost. This view is held by a number of careful scholars who point to the grammatical strangeness of ending on Ga, to the physical realities of ancient manuscripts, to the sense that several early readers and scribes seemed to know that something was missing, and to the fact that Matthew and Luke, both of whom almost certainly used Mark as a source when writing their own Gospels, include resurrection appearances that have no clear parallel in the 16 chapters of Mark as it now stands. The argument goes roughly like this. Mark wrote a complete Gospel that had a resurrection appearance narrative following verse 8. That ending was present in the original manuscript, at some point in the early history of the text, probably before the Gospel had been widely copied. The final section of the manuscript was damaged or lost. The last page of an ancient scroll or codex was the most physically vulnerable part of the document, most exposed to wear and moisture and damage. Many ancient texts lost their endings this way. The Gospel of Mark may simply be one of them. If this is true, Matthew and Luke may have been drawing on a version of Mark that still had its ending when they incorporated Mark into their own accounts. The Galilean appearance that Jesus promises in Mark 16, verse 7, "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you," may have been fulfilled in a passage that no longer exists. The story may have continued past verse 8 in a way that gave the disciples their restoration, gave Peter his redemption, gave the reader the confirmation that the longer ending later attempted to supply. The cost of accepting this possibility is a different kind of weight. It is the weight of permanent and irrecoverable uncertainty. If the original ending was lost, it is gone in a way that is final. There is no lost scroll waiting in a desert cave. There is no monastery library that holds the complete text, the ending that Mark wrote, if he wrote one, has not survived. And what that means is that the oldest gospel we have is permanently incomplete. That we are reading a text with a missing final chapter. That somewhere in the transmission of the most studied document in Western history, something fell off the edge and did not come back. That is not a comfortable thought. But discomfort and error are not the same thing. The manuscript record does not preserve the ending. The church fathers who knew their manuscripts reported its absence. The blank column in Codex Vaticanus suggests a scribe in the 4th century suspected something was missing. The physical vulnerability of ancient manuscripts is well documented. All of this is consistent with loss rather than intention. What this possibility cannot give you is a reconstruction of what was lost. Speculation is possible. The Galilean promise points in one direction. The pattern of the other Gospels points in another. But speculation is all it is. The ending that was lost, if it was lost, cannot be recovered from the evidence that remains. And then there is the third possibility. The third possibility is that the longer ending, Mark 16 verses 9 through 20, preserves genuine ancient tradition, even if it was not written by Mark himself. This reading takes seriously what the manuscript history actually shows. The longer ending is ancient. It was being cited as scripture by Irenaeus in the 2nd century. It appears in the Diatessaron and in other early Christian texts. It has been read in Christian communities for nearly 2,000 years. In the King James Bible, which shaped the English language and the spiritual lives of more people than any other English text in history. The longer ending is simply part of the Gospel of Mark. Generations of Christians heard it read from pulpits and never had any reason to question whether it belonged there. Because for the communities that formed their faith, it did belong there. The cost of accepting this possibility is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that requires separating two questions that are easy to conflate. The question of whether the longer ending was written by Mark is a different question from whether it carries genuine tradition and genuine meaning. A passage can be a later addition and still preserve real memory, real practice, real theology that was already circulating in the communities that produced it. The longer ending was not written from nothing. It drew on resurrection traditions that existed in the early church. Traditions also reflected in Matthew and Luke and John and Paul. Whether those traditions came from a lost ending of Mark, or from independent sources, or from some combination, the traditions themselves were there. What is not honest is treating the footnote in your Bible as a minor technical curiosity that does not affect what you are reading. The question is real. The evidence for it is real. The scholars and church fathers who identified the problem were real people doing real work on real manuscripts. The blank column in Codex Vaticanus was left by a real scribe who made a real decision. Now here is what every person who has thought carefully about this problem eventually arrives at, regardless of which possibility they find most persuasive. All three possibilities begin in the same place. 3 women at an empty tomb, a message given, a command to speak, and silence. Whatever happened to the text, whether the original ending was lost, or was never written, or was preserved in the 12 verses that most Bibles include, none of it changes what Mark has given us at that moment. The tomb is empty. The news is real. The first people to receive it were afraid. And the question of what comes next, the question of who speaks, and when, and to whom, and what words are adequate to carry something this large, that question was not answered by Mark. It was handed to everyone who came after. It was handed to the scribes who could not leave the page blank. It was handed to the church fathers who argued about which manuscripts were accurate. It was handed to Tischendorf, finding old parchment in a fireplace basket. It was handed to the scholars who spent the 20th century trying to understand what the manuscript evidence meant. It was handed to the communities that read the King James Bible for 4 centuries without knowing about the footnote. It was handed to every person who has ever read verse 8 and felt the story stop too soon. It was handed, right now, to you. The question Mark leaves open is not a problem to be solved before you can take the gospel seriously. The question is the gospel. Here is a question that the Gospel of Mark never answers. If the women said nothing to anyone, how do you know this story? Not as a theological puzzle, as a real question with real weight behind it. Mark 16, verse 8 tells you that the first people who knew ran away in silence. They told nobody. The text is explicit about this. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The information was sealed inside 3 people who could not yet bring themselves to speak it. And yet here you are, having heard every word of it. Somewhere between that silent morning outside Jerusalem and this moment, the story got out. The silence broke. A woman who had been running found her voice, or found a listener, or found that the thing she was carrying was too large and too real to stay contained inside her any longer. We do not know when. We do not know where. We do not know what the first telling sounded like, whether it came out in a rush or in a whisper, whether the person who first heard it believed immediately or stood there, unable to find a response that fit. Mark does not tell us any of that. Mark tells us the moment before, the last moment of silence before the speaking began. And then the text stops, and nearly 2,000 years of history begin. Think about what that history looks like from a certain distance. Within weeks of the crucifixion, Paul writes later, there were people in Jerusalem claiming that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Within years, those claims were circulating in communities across the Mediterranean world. Within decades, the first written gospel was produced, and that gospel ended, in its oldest recoverable form, with 3 women running away from an empty tomb in silence. Within a century, scribes who encountered that ending were already adding to it, completing it, bridging the gap between the silence of verse 8 and the proclamation that the church had already been making for generations. The women were silent for a moment on a road outside Jerusalem. The story they were too afraid to tell became the most widely distributed text in human history. Something happened between those 2 facts. Something that Mark, whether deliberately or because the ending was lost, or because an accident of transmission turned out to be more powerful than any intention could have planned, chose not to record. That something is the space where the reader lives. There is a concept in the study of literature that describes what happens when a text refuses to complete itself. When the narrative reaches a point where it could close and instead remains open. When the story hands the unresolved thing to the person holding it and says, "From here, this is yours." Most people have felt it without needing a name for it. You finish something and the central question has not been answered. You sit with it and realize the question was never going to be answered on the page. That the whole movement of the narrative was toward this moment of incompletion. This handing over, this placing of the unfinished thing into your hands, specifically because you are the only one left who can do anything with it. Mark may be the oldest example of that kind of text in the Western world. or the ending may have been lost. And what feels like a profound literary openness may be the accidental result of a damaged manuscript. But even if it was an accident, the text we have is the text that generations of readers have held. The communities that formed their faith around this gospel were reading a text that ended at verse 8, and they found in it what they found in it: the empty tomb and the message and the fear, and they built something from that. The accident, if it was an accident, became indistinguishable from the intention. A gospel that shows you the full arc, the appearances, the Great Commission, the ascension, the disciples going everywhere and preaching, is a gospel about what happened to other people a long time ago. A gospel that stops at the silence is a gospel that hands the arc to you. That is either the most audacious thing a gospel writer ever did, or the most accidental result that ever produced something meaningful. The longer you sit with the ending of Mark, the harder it becomes to be certain which one it is. Mark keeps you in that gap. The longer ending lets you out of it. Both are gifts. They are different gifts. And 2,000 years of manuscript history, of scribes adding and leaving spaces and arguing and preserving and transmitting, suggests that the church has always needed both of them: the open wound and the suture, the silence and the speaking, the gap and the closure. Mark, in its oldest recoverable form, gives you one of those things. It gives you the gap, and it trusts you to find the other. There is a detail in the very first chapter of Mark that takes on a different quality when you read it against the ending. When Jesus is baptized and comes up out of the water, Mark says the heavens were torn open. The Greek word is schizo. It means ripped apart, split, divided, not parted gracefully, not opened like a door swings open on its hinge. Torn, the way a piece of cloth tears when it cannot contain the pressure applied to it from both sides. The same word appears one other time in the Gospel of Mark. At the moment Jesus dies on the cross, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Torn. At the beginning, the heavens. At the end, the curtain. The Gospel of Mark is framed by things being torn open that were meant to stay sealed. The boundary between the divine and the human, torn at the baptism. The boundary between the holy and the ordinary, torn at the death. And then the tomb, which is also a sealed space, is found open. The stone rolled away. The place of death become the place of announcement. The boundary between the living and the dead, not torn exactly, but found to have failed to hold what was placed inside it. Mark is a gospel about sealed things that cannot stay sealed, about boundaries that cannot contain what is pressing against them from the other side, about the ordinary world failing, repeatedly and dramatically, to hold the weight of what is moving through it. And it ends with 3 women trying to hold the news inside them. The torn heavens at the baptism, the torn curtain at the death, the open tomb at the resurrection, and somewhere, on an unmarked road in first-century Judea, the sealed silence of 3 frightened women, torn open by the weight of what they knew. The Gospel of Mark ends at the empty tomb with 3 frightened women and a silence that could not hold. Every reader who has ever reached verse 8 and felt the need for more has been proving that the silence could not hold. The story was never going to end on the page. The tomb is empty. The message has been given. The silence is yours now. What are you going to do with it?